Okay.
Are we live?
Yes, we're just gonna get set up a little bit. I don't know who's in, but hello everybody, whoever is in, if anybody is in. So, just we're gonna wait a few minutes just to get set up.
Oh, Bliss is here.
Hi Bliss, how are you?
That's cool.
Wait, so I need to watch this as well. Oh, I don't know how to mute my thing. Okay. Sounds good. Okay. Okay, guys. So, I don't know how many of you guys are in, but if you are in, thank you everybody for joining us. So, today, this is our very first session of our Youth2Talk, our live stream video podcast where me, June, and somebody else, our co-host, will be talking to you about various things. Now, to introduce this entire kind of podcast thing, what this is purposed for, what we're going to do within these podcasts are we're going to talk about various, let's say, contemporary events and different topics that relate to our present day lives, and we're going to kind of see where these topics and these events kind of intersect with our own Christianity, and how we ought to view this and look at these topics and live basically our lives according to what we say we believe. So for our podcast today, I am here with my first co-host that we have on our first session is Julianne. Julianne, say hello.
Hello.
So today we're going to be talking about a topic that's very relevant right now, especially with all the things that have happened in the past few weeks. So today we're going to talk about race and racism and try to find the intersection between the topic of racism and our Christianity. Now, also I want to remind you guys that at the end of our podcast, we're also going to take some questions that you guys bring up and you guys type in the chat. I'll be keeping note of those, and any questions that I think is relevant, we will discuss it at the end of this podcast. So if you have any questions while we're talking, or if you always had a question about this topic and you want us to kind of talk about it, if you can just kind of type out your question into the chat, I'll take a look at it, and then we might have time to discuss it at the end of the podcast. So with that, Julianne, we're going to talk today about the topic of racism. So what I want you to do just right now is just to tell me what you think racism is, your definition of racism, and kind of the nuances of what you expect or how you perceive racism to be.
Okay, so when I think of racism, what I think of is generally like some form of prejudice or oppression against somebody because of the color of their skin or like their race.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of racism do you think is more prevalent in your life, and what do you associate usually with when you hear the word racism?
Well, personally, I don't really experience too much racism, thankfully, but mostly the forms of racism that I experience are often just like racist jokes or comments that aren't like necessarily like violent, but I guess still count as racism.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time, I guess, when I think of racism, my mind does often normally go more towards like, I think of the more violent acts of racism.
So,
but I don't experience it myself.
so extreme cases of racism is much more, let's say, apparent than, let's say, low-key racism, or racism that we would, like, racist jokes and stuff. It'll be like, oh, it's just a joke or stuff. We could just kind of blow it off as, oh, he's just joking. But that is a form of racism, and we'll kind of discuss that. So for today, I'm sorry, I exited out of something. So for today, what we're going to talk about is, first, we need to talk about what racism is. So Julianne, I want you to tell me your definition of racism, or how you just try to explain as best you can a detailed kind of definition that you could give right now.
Okay, so like I said before, I tend to think of it as like prejudice or oppression against somebody based on the color of their skin. But I have done a little bit of research, and according to like the Oxford Dictionary, they also say that prejudice and like discrimination against an ethnic group also counts as racism, which, if I guess we take that into accommodation as well, it kind of broadens the term of racism even more to not just people of color, but also it could be just someone who's not from the same place that you are.
Okay. So you said, okay, so this broadens your understanding of racism. The fact that it's also like an ethnic thing. How does it broaden your understanding? Like, what specifically broadened your understanding when you saw that, oh, hey, it also pertains to ethnicity?
Mm-hmm. Well, originally, when I think of racism, I always think of people of different skin colors, like whites or blacks or Asians or Latinos or whatever, and race and like discrimination between those different groups would be like racism. Whereas with this new like understanding, it could be like, such as if some Korean people are still like think all like Japanese people are bad because of what happened in the past, then that could also count as racism, even though they're both Asians. Yeah. But they're ethnically different.
Actually, that's very interesting, Julianne, because this is also an example that I thought of when I was thinking about racism. So when I was actually when I decided to do our first podcast on racism, I had to do a little research as well, go a little bit deeper. What is racism actually? So I looked through various interpretations, various definitions of racism, and most of them had to do with stuff we talked about: discrimination, stuff about antagonizing another person because of their race, or prejudice that people may have. But and then I looked at some of the Oxford and the Merriam-Webster definition, and they also had stuff like that, but there was a specific portion within their definition that I liked the most. And let me read to you. This is from the Merriam-Webster's definition. It says, a belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities, in that racial differences produce an inherent superiority or inferiority of a particular race. Now, this is the definition I actually liked the most because it was very uninterpretive. What I mean, it didn't talk about any effects of racism, like prejudice, like, oh, people hitting other people, killing other people, and stuff like that. It talked about just a belief. So, and I think that is state. Yeah, and I think that's very true, because racism shouldn't be understood by the results it shows. It should be understood by what it is. And racism, in its innate essence, is a belief that people hold to. And that belief is further determined and described by the belief that race is first a primary determinant. So race is when a racist or somebody who holds to a racist belief, what they think is that race is a primary determinant. It's the main factor that shapes your human traits and capacity. So it's in the same line of, oh, Asians are good at math. If you're Asian, you're good at math. Because you're Asian, you're good at math. See, because you're of a certain race, that race is the main factor that creates you, your personality, who you are, what you're good at, what you're bad at. And then the second half of that definition is this: and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority or an inferiority. So it's not just the fact that, okay, race determines your personality, your ability, your potential, all that, but it's also that race also determines whether you are superior or inferior. And this definition given by Merriam-Webster was a very enlightening one for me, a one that I could look at, understand, and really actually say, yeah, this is actually true. Racism is inherently a belief system that people choose to hold to. And now, when I was looking at this definition of racism, the noun that's being described is the word race and how people deal with race. And that also got me thinking, okay, well, what does race mean? What is the definition of race? So I went through the dictionary once again. I Googled a whole bunch of different dictionary kind of searches, and I was trying to figure out what other people's definition of race is. And the best one that I could come up with is from dictionary.com. It's a anthropological definition, and it goes to: race is a socially constructed category of identification based on physical traits, ancestry, historical affiliation, or shared culture. Now, bringing all these definitions together, so race,
Yeah.
So what I saw here was a very, very interesting kind of pattern, because not only both racism and race are determined by people. It's not determined by nature or something or other, because race is a socially constructed category. It's not like race is a genus and species. We're all Homo sapiens. It's something that people have created to group people together based on physical characteristics, ancestry, what have you, etc. Also, in other kind of definitions, it also denotes that commonly race also denotes shared language and national affiliation. So your nationality and the language that you speak are also closely related to your race, or can be closely related to your race. So when I was looking through all these definitions, not only of racism and race, what I found was the fact that racism and race are all created by humanity. We, as humans in society, decide to place race on others, place racism on others. It's a belief that we've created and a belief that we hold to. So, when I was looking through this, the only kind of repeating thing that I just found was that humans are the problem. It's not nature that's the problem. It's not anything else that's the problem. It's that humans create race, and then they create racism.
Yeah.
What do you?
And I think that also goes along with many other things. Like, it just comes from an inner desire from humans to want to be better than others, and they use differences between different people to make that a reality for them.
Yeah, and I think, okay, with everything that's happened today, with all the George Floyd things, and even before that, all the racial prejudice, racial discrimination, not only in America, but in the world as a whole, there is so much of this going on, and we've just began to reveal more and more and become more aware of all of these kind of things. Now that we've kind of discussed the definition of racism, what I wanted to kind of do is figure out what the foundation of racism is. I've already discussed to you that I think the foundation of racism is people, but more specifically, what about people causes this racism? And you kind of got into it, but I want to go more in depth with with the kind of way that we've progressed so far throughout this discussion. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was historical context. Julianne, do you have any kind of knowledge or idea of the historical understanding of racism?
I think I have a general understanding of it.
So what do you think about it? What is your knowledge so far?
Okay, when I think of racism historically, like how it came to be, my thoughts kind of go to how in like the age of exploration and stuff, most of those countries were all European countries, were like generally white countries. And in history, they were the countries that had the best technology at the time. They had big ships and they had guns. And so when they traveled to places like Africa and then to the Americas eventually, when they would interact with the people that were living in those different places, because they had all this technology, their minds kind of went to thinking that they were superior. And then not only that, but they kind of branched over and saw the difference in the way those people were, like culturally and physically different because of being from a different place. And they kind of over time attributed that as well to why they were superior.
Okay, I think I kind of understand what you're going at, and you're actually very right. The fact that in history, and the racism has been a part of history since, because if we go down to the understanding that it's a belief that people have about race being either superior or an inferior, this kind of understanding has always been there in some degree throughout history. If a nation wanted to attack another nation, there is always this understanding that they have is, oh, we're better than these people, we deserve to have their land or whatever, and they're inferior to us, so we can kill them off or make them our slaves or stuff like that. There's always an aspect of racism and racial superiority in those kind of wars and these nations against nations battling themselves throughout history. Mm-hmm. And racism is also very much, especially when we see worldwide, we see a predominant form of racism towards a specific race, and that is the Africans. So why we see that is what you've talked about, colonialism and imperialism and all these nations going in and basically claiming they're more superior in one way or another by taking over and taking advantage and all of this. But why this one group, the Africans, became such a oppressed race is because of what we call today the transatlantic slave trade. And this is the main thing, point in history where we can see that this race has been so oppressed and so discriminated by the entire world, because indigenous Africans were being sold as slaves all around the world through the Atlantic slave trade, especially to America, because that's where most of the transatlantic slave trade ended up, in America, because that's the new world where they needed the most labor. And that's why when we look at the situation we have today, we see the fact that, oh, hey, this race, the Africans, are in fact historically the most oppressed race. Now, we do have lots of racism and lots of different races to be that racism has been done towards. But throughout history overall, the Africans have been on the receiving end of most of that, and that's what we see not only in America, not only in Canada, not only in parts of Europe, but it's a very worldwide thing. And because most of the transatlantic slave trade was into America, so right now in America, we see that the results of that more. We see the oppression that the African Americans face today because of all this historical crap that went on. Now, in a historical context, more so in an American historical context, because that's what I was focusing on most. This is what happens. Now, we also have various different racism also. During World War II, there was a lot of racism against the Japanese Americans that were placed in the concentration camps. There's a lot of racism towards the Mexicans because of everything that happened on the U.S. southern border. So there's a lot of racism definitely going on. And all of this has historical foundations behind it, is what I'm trying to say. The fact that the transatlantic slave trade was the biggest reason for all this African American racism, the reason why these wars against the Mexico and all that became this foundation for racism against them, because of Japanese invading Korea and doing all this crap within Korea, the racism between Japanese and Koreans. It's just, there's history behind it, and we have to understand the context. It's a good way to understand this context of modern racism. Of these modern racism, these communities and groups and races that are racist against one another, there is a historical background to them, for sure. I'm not saying that's all, but that is a part, and a part that we should try to understand, because it really shines light towards why some things are the way they are.
And I think what's interesting is that it kind of, I guess by certain, qualities, it was able to like flourish, because if you think about American history, America was like small at first, but then more and more people started coming over, and then the population just started growing and growing. And in order to have like farms and stuff, farmers needed more workers, and originally they used what were called indentured servants, which were normally poor white immigrants that would come the farmers would pay the voyage across the sea for them so that the immigrants would then work for them as servants for several years. But then there were some revolts from these servants, and so farmers actually became kind of afraid of them, and so they started turning to African slavery, which there was already slavery in Africa between different like African tribes and stuff. So they started like trade with them in order to get a new labor force to supply them for their labor, because they could They did try using Native Americans, but because of how they weren't acclimated to the diseases from that were brought over from the Europeans, a lot of them ended up dying, and so the white settlers weren't able to use them. So that's kind of how it ended up being. And also the fact that since Africa is such a large country, there happened to be, I guess, many Africans that they could use for the slave trade.
Yeah, for sure. And this is just historical context that we need to understand. I mean, we shouldn't be ignorant of it because it helps us fill in the gaps to understanding this topic of race and racism. Without this context, we have a huge gaping hole in our knowledge of why this has become the way it is today. So I wanted to go through a little bit of that historical context with you, just so that we can understand, hey, this is kind of like the background, the setting that created what has become what it is today. Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to speak a little bit more about historical context a little bit later. I'm going to weave that in if possible, but we're going to talk about now, since we've gone through the historical context, we're going to talk about, okay, so we've already kind of decided, okay, racism begins with humans. Now, what in humans creates this racism, this kind of desire to be superior, for just think their race is superior than another, or this other race is inferior from them. And as you've talked about, and as we've both talked about a little bit in the past, it's the fact that humans have an innate desire to have power and be more superior than another person. Now, for a lack of a better word, I am going to call this pride. Okay? I'm going to call this pride. And specific to racism. Now, wait, let me explain a little bit more what I mean by this. So, we're trying to get at the foundation of racism. So, the rock bottom, the concrete block that we build racism up from. And if you want to think about it in a more image-related way, think about a kind of bubble map. Do you guys know what a bubble map is? A bubble map is, you have like this big bubble, like, oh, this is animals. It has like the lines. And then if this is animals, there's lines going on. One of it is like, oh, sea animals, oh, birds, oh, mammals. And then from there you have like, oh, sea animals, you have like dolphins and fish and stuff. And then birds, and then kangaroos and all that as mammals. So like we have these, so if you think about a bubble map, you can think about it like this. Okay, racism is not a main bubble, it's a branch bubble. And the main bubble, the problem, the foundation is the fact that people desire to be superior than other people. The fact that we have pride in ourselves. And this main bubble becomes and one branch of that main bubble is what we call racism, because this understanding of superiority can also be related to all these different things, not just race. You want to be superior in finances, you want to be superior in social status, you want to be superior in intellect, or in
there's other things skill. Like sexism, anti-Semitism,
you see
forms of prejudice.
The fact that the pride is the foundation, the origin of all these things is what we have to understand. And what I've gotten through my study, or my, let's say it's a very lacking study, but still I've done a little bit of research, done a definition search, and I've realized the fact that no, it is pride. It is humans wanting to be superior than another person. And with that main idea comes racism. And now, when I've looked through and tried to understand racism in terms of this pride, the racism that I've looked at throughout history and now, what I can link this to is three different aspects. And this is just my kind of thoughts and opinion. It's not like I know everything. I am very lacking in much knowledge, but this is what I saw mostly. The kind of pride that creates racism is when we look throughout history. The first pride that I saw was nationalism or patriotism. The kind of pride in your own nation, the place. You gave us the understanding of Koreans versus Japanese. You know, there was a war going on between them. There was strife, and there was a lot of other things. I'm just summarizing a very lacking summary for sure. There's a lot of things, but in any case, there is now Japanese and American. Japanese and Korean anonymity, anonymity. I'm sure that's the right word.
Animosity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they just don't like each other. And it comes from a lot of different reasons, for sure. Not only throughout history, but in their relations right now. But the fact is, we shouldn't group people in races and then judge them based on their race. That is what we call racism. One Japanese person should not define, or a few Japanese people, or the past actions of the Japanese people should not then make us judge the Japanese. It's like, okay, that Japanese person that's living in Japan right now, that person may have had nothing to do with the Korean-Japanese War, or the atrocities committed in that war and after that war, or any other thing. But why do we just hate the Japanese? Because why do I have to hate that one Japanese person and judge him because of all the things that have happened? You see, humans group people and have pride in their nation. It's kind of weird how people are so patriotic and are so nationalist, because when you look at it in that way, you're not looking at people as individuals, you're looking at people as nations, as countries, as governments. And people are much more than that. They should be considered, each person should be considered an individual, not a mass grouping of persons. But what I've seen throughout kind of my historical research and understanding of that is the fact that pride in your nationality, pride in what your country is, where your country is kind of a big part of racism throughout history and now as well.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I
think I wanted you to do.
Just give my thoughts on it?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's just interesting how, I don't know, just that, like, the way this has, like, developed to where even though, like, you don't even know the person and people already have such strong feelings about them, even though they don't even know anything about them.
Yeah, just because they're Japanese, a Korean might hate this person without knowing anything about them.
I just think that's so, I guess it's just very strange, because it definitely should not define a person, the actions of another, because in pretty much any group that you can think of, there's always, I guess, the bad ones, or however you want to call them. People who maybe don't have such great actions. But of course that shouldn't define, like, all of the other people who you haven't even met, you don't like, just because they're part of a group. And especially a group like this where it's not like they signed up to be Japanese or to be Korean or whatever. Like, they're just born who they are. It's interesting how people judge them for just being born into a certain identity.
It's what I've seen commonly throughout, like historically, like right now. The fact that, you see, for me, I've never felt very nationalistic or patriotistic, because I was born in Korea and I traveled around a lot. I didn't stay in one place for very long, so whenever I was in Korea, I can't read or write Korean. Korean was very hard. I can understand a little bit, not like fully as much as I should. So whenever I go to Korea, I don't feel like I'm Korean. I don't feel like I belong there. And my primary language is English. I speak and read and write English. But then when I come to America, what happens is I have to struggle with visa issues and stuff like that, because the American government is saying, "Oh, you don't belong here. You have to." And it's weird, because I feel like, oh, well, I'm not here or there. I'm just, and then I think that kind of understanding this kind of all these kind of aspects of my life brought me to an understanding that, hey, I'm just an individual. I'm not actually defined by my Korean heritage or my primary English speaking, my native English tongue or what have you. I'm just individually me, and these things really have no part to actually understanding who I am, except maybe the fact that, oh, my skin tone is this way, I have black hair, my eyes are a little bit more line wise than circular. But yeah, see, we have to look and know and see and perceive people to be individuals. But what governments want and what people usually do is they try to nationalize themselves. They take pride in their identity in nations, as a nation. And I'm not saying that's bad, but it's a slippery slope between nationalism and patriotism, and that becoming racism. It's a line that's easier to cross when nationalism and patriotism is in effect.
Yeah, because that's kind of, especially like as far as like nationally and like ethnically, that kind of form of racism often does come from feeling a strong sense of nationalism for your country. You can then, if you then, instead of focusing just solely on your country and like kind of point it towards other countries, like, hey, my country's better than your country, and then like thoughts of racism can come up from that for sure.
And actually, that's actually I don't want to get political. I have no interest in politics or anything the government does. I just want to obey them and just live my life. But the overwhelming kind of motto of Trump was "Make America Great Again." This kind of nationalist and patriotistic kind of slogan. And as you can see, that and racism is fairly interconnected. Yeah. It's a really shallow, a very thin line from nationalism and patriotism to racism. Yeah.
It's really a very thin line. Yeah. Because it goes from like supporting your country to, and like believing and like trying to make it great and whatever, to turning it into, oh, I want it to be not only great but better than all these other countries. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, we are better than those. All of a sudden.
Yeah, and I think that kind of also reflects in Trump's immigration policies and all of these things as well. It's what I've seen is that this kind of national pride, this kind of patriotism is very connected, very kind of not, let's say not directly related, but somewhat related to racism. And now, as just in case we continue to talk too long about this, let's go into our second aspect. And the second aspect that I saw is that not only is nationalism and patriotism a factor in the creation of racism, but also a societal and cultural kind of pride. You know, people having pride in their culture and their society. And I'm also not saying that being proud of your social society and your culture is bad, but that also is a line that stands right beside racism. Because during history, when people were invading another country, they were like, oh yeah, our culture is better, our society is better, let's go and share our culture and society to these people by, you know, defeating them and dominating them or annexing them or what have you. It's a very standard repetition of history. The fact that not only is our nation better, but our society is better and our culture is better.
I think it's, I like that you made this a separate aspect from nationalism because, yes, those two, like, culture and your nationalism can go together, but they can also be kind of more separate, like how you said, like, where they're imposing their cultures on other cultures and kind of just totally wiping it out. And they're not necessarily, I guess, instilling a sense of nationalism, but just making them, like, almost forcing them to give up theirs and take on a new culture that is apparently better than the other one. And I think that's, yeah, definitely, I mean, personally, like, I know you said earlier how you're necessarily, like, feel an identity with, like, being Korean, like nationally. I kind of feel like the same way for slightly different reasons. I can't really speak Korean at all. I've never been to Korea, but I am, like, Korean, obviously. I've been born in America, lived in America, life, speak English fluently. Like, that's kind of the only language I can speak. But I kind of also don't really, despite living in America, like, my entire life, I don't necessarily feel like a national, like strong nationalism. Like, yes, I'm American, but I'm not, like, super national about it. But, and then the same way is for Korea, because I just kind of feel very distant from it. But at the same time, I do, like, appreciate, like, Korean culture a lot. Like, so that's why I'm glad that you, like, kind of differentiated between the two, because I do feel like they're different. Because personally, from my personal experiences, I don't feel, like, super patriotic about being Korean and stuff. It's just kind of, like, part of my identity or whatever. But I do feel, like, culturally, like, very Korean, because especially because I go to a Korean church and I have, like, Korean friends. I guess I know a little bit of Korean or whatever, but and also just, like, the food and just, like, kind of knowing just all the little nuances of the culture. So I think it's great that you kind of differentiated between them.
Yeah. And the thing is, they're very related, but they're also, like, a little bit different. Yeah, they're still
different.
Yeah, they have a nuance to them that we need to separate and discuss. So that's why I did separate the fact that nationalism, patriotism is different from societal and cultural pride. And but it's very related. You can see it is very related. In history, it's very related because in your nation, your culture is also fairly similar as opposed to a different nation.
And it's often a very big part of your identity. Like, for people who aren't as patriotic, maybe that's not, like, part of their identity, but the culture will always or almost always be a part of their identity, whether they want it to be or not, because that's just how they live, essentially.
Yeah, see? So, and this is what I wanted to talk about, because it is not only just a national patriotic thing, it's also a societal and cultural thing. And now my third thing, and this is one of the also another important aspect is the ideology and religion aspect of this. Because these are all three of these are very interconnected. Because when because especially throughout history as well, when you're when you are affiliated with this one nationality, this one nation, nations were very mono-religious throughout history, and they would persecute anybody who was of a different religion. So there's a lot of instances of that throughout history. So the fact that ideology and religion, the pride in their ideology and their religion, also has a good kind of aspect, a good link towards racism as well.
Yeah.
Because
You said, there's tons of historical examples of just, pride in your religion, or just like feeling like other religions are inferior. Like, there are tons of examples of that, like how
and what the biggest
started, the Jews persecuted the Christians, and then when Hitler persecuted the Jews, and then when just like everything, there's so many examples.
And when you bring up Hitler, it's actually a very good example, because Hitler, his basic philosophy was the fact that, hey, Germans are the Aryan race is the most superior race, so we need to massively wipe out all the inferior races and create a perfect world, a perfect society made up of only our race. And
interestingly enough, he brought in many different aspects to say why they were superior. He used physical traits like the blue eyes and blonde hair and stuff like that. He used religion, like saying that that Jews were inferior, that they were bad, and just kind of social status, and just ethnicity, and a lot of different things to kind of put together, I guess, why the Aryans were superior.
And you know what the most of ideology or religious kind of racism, what it tends to throughout history, where it comes from, is Christianity. If you look at just British history, you can see the Anglo-Saxons that were pagan Crusades. Come in, become Christians, and then they would be also just a small fact. It also pertains that, hey, their races were different, but also it was a religious thing as well. They considered themselves Christians, and when these kind of Viking barbarians, pagans started coming in and invading, not only was it, oh, hey, let's get rid of these Vikings that are attacking and pillaging, it's also, hey, we're Christian, they're not, so let's attack them. That was also an aspect of British history. There's also an entire thing about the Crusades, as you talked about, the fact that, the Crusades were just, in the Byzantine Empire, it was Christianity reigned supreme. And the fact that, oh, hey, the Pope just says, oh, hey, go on a crusade, get that holy city back, kill all the Muslims.
Kill all of them.
And then they're like, oh, okay. And you know what? Jews also, that's where anti-Semitism actually began to take root. The fact that during the Crusades, Christians killed a whole bunch of Jews. Because they're like, oh yeah, Jews crucified Christ, let's kill them all.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, despite how Christianity is supposed to be oh, love everyone, God loves everyone, God created all things and stuff, it's interesting to see how they use Christianity to justify all these terrible acts, like the Crusades. They're oh, they're not Christians, so we have to exterminate them. And then also it also ties back into slavery. Slave masters would quote the Bible and be well, it said that the slave must listen to their master, and they use that as support for why they were superior. And also whenever explorers first came to the Americas and met the natives, they saw them and they were like, well, God allowed us to come here to take this land. God gave it to us. And they're like barbarians. They're not Christians, so we have a right to take over. And
and that was you see how all these kind of things are connected, because they are very these three things, what I've seen throughout history, or what I've looked at, and I've just come to the conclusion. I'm not saying this is a conclusive answer to everything racism, but what I've seen and my understanding of the studies that I've done is the fact that these three aspects were very related to how racism became and developed to what it is today. And the fact is, I mean, as Christians, what we ought to do is look at this and say, wow, this was definitely not Christian for sure. But we have to also understand where we should lie then as Christians in the topic, in the subject of racism. And now, you see, these are the three things that I've come up with. The fact that nationalism and patriotism, societal and cultural differences, and then ideology or religion, the beliefs and dogmas that people may hold. These three things, or pride in these three things, were a great factor in what we have as racism today. And so, so this will conclude kind of our informational aspect of where we kind of discuss racism and the foundations of racism, and we'll get into more questions and answers today, but for today in a little bit. But what I want to conclude this informational time with is the fact that we have to understand racism for what it truly is, and not only understand the definition of racism, but understand the historical context, the philosophical context, the underlying foundational aspect of racism. And what I want not everyone to understand is this thing, the fact that these three prides, like national pride, societal cultural pride, ideological religious pride, these kind of things factor into racism. Why do you think Americans are racist towards the Middle East and the Arabs and people wearing hijabs and stuff like that? It's because not only of the Middle Eastern wars, but also because it was kind of during that time America was still predominantly what they claim to be Christian, and so it was almost a Christian versus Islam kind of battle. And see, all of these aspects actually merge into one and become what is racism today. So with that, while concluding this aspect of our informational time, what I want to get in is our questions that we have for each other, and kind of discuss these questions that we may have. Now, you people, viewers, if you have any questions that you want us to discuss, please write it down in the chat. And then as we talk about stuff, I will keep track of all of the questions that are asked, and I will, we'll discuss it if we have the time. So please, ask your questions. But Julianne, I think we had one question that we had in common, and I want to start with that question. Is the fact that it's more on the lines of, have you personally experienced racism, or how have you experienced racism? And I want you to go first and kind of discuss your kind of personal experience with this.
Okay, so I kind of said a little bit before how I haven't experienced any violence, unlike, I guess, other people may have. Personally, it's more of non-violent racism, more, I guess, the more passive racism, where it's generally like jokes and just like comments, normally like stereotypes, stuff like that, like, oh, like Asians eat dogs, or, stuff like that, like, oh, Asians have eyes, kind of like stuff like that.
And you would say that this is not actually harmful. I mean, it isn't. It's just like, oh, they're joking. And we could say it's not harmful, but the fact is, whether it's harmful in terms of physically, emotionally, like you yourself, when you hear these jokes or something, it's like, oh, as long as I'm not harmed or they're not harmed when I say this joke, it's fine. But it's actually not the case. It's because these jokes and these things that we do actually kind of show and personify something we have within us, this kind of belief we have within us, that we group people and then we generalize them as this group, as this race, and then we define them, and then we place superiority or inferiority based on this fact. So
yeah, I definitely, I kind of, I guess you could say, see, okay, I know that, like, pretty much I think everyone watching this is also Asian. I think some people can agree with me in the fact that a lot of times when these jokes are made, when the jokes are made generally, it's with, you are normally the only Asian or like one of the few in the group, and oftentimes you just kind of go along with it, or at least in my experiences, I normally just kind of go along with it. But I think personally, if I'm to like be honest about it, I would say that I'm not okay with it. I don't really like it when people make racist jokes, especially because, like, they're so, I guess I just kind of know the stereotypes already. Like, I just know it already, and it's almost like they're just repeating it over and over and over again. And, like, it just kind of keeps ingraining it, like, in my head. And it's kind of, I don't know, it just kind of makes me tired of being around the people that make those jokes sometimes, because it's not exactly, like, yes, it's a joke, so it'll maybe, like, create some laughter, but it's not truly at its base, it's not really joyful, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't really bring any joy to, like, participate in that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah. The joy is found on the people doing it when they feel a little bit more superior than who they're joking about. And see, this is what I go with when I talk about this innate understanding that racism is linked to the innate human desire for superiority, or just aka pride. Now, personally, when I think about racism, I am older than you guys.
Yeah.
I was in America before you were born. So with that, when I was in America, it was much different time than when you guys are now in America. Because when I was in America, there were almost no Koreans and or just Asians in general in the kind of neighborhood and the entire kind of city that I lived in, because I lived in kind of the East Coast. And in my school, there was actually no Asians except me. Like, in the entire school, there was no Asians except... I know that for some of you, that might also be the case. Like, you're the only Asian. But for me, it was like, not only was I the only Asian at the school, but I was basically the only Asian in the district. So it was like, there was almost no Koreans and almost no Asians. So it was... But I don't know if I was a little kid then, so I don't know if I was just not aware of these things, but I've never felt like racism towards me when I was younger and in America. But like, when I came back as a college student and I was here, that's when I felt racism more for some reason. Maybe because I was just more aware of what people were saying at that time or something. But when I was in America, so I came for college, and so there was just weird instances where people would like shout "ching chong" at me, and also started speaking gibberish, like they were speaking Chinese, and they were like doing it in my face. It was just like, I was like, what are you doing? It's not really offensive. It was just like, what are you doing? It was, and it was kind of weird. I was like, why are they doing this? But then when I kind of more or less felt this more oppressive racism was when I moved to Texas to finish my college. So when I moved to Texas to finish my bachelor's degree, what happened was as a Korean, I had to go to the international office and then work out all the things so that they know I'm here legally and not illegally. So, and we would always, every year, have this kind of seminar where only the international students are required to come to. And in these seminars, a lawyer would come out and talk to us about, okay, you're an international student. You're here because we let you stay here. So you have to do this and that and that. So basically what this entailed, what they were telling us, oh, hey, this is what you can and cannot do. But it was very interesting. It was very interesting because there were also, as a international student, I'm not allowed to work, okay, in America. That's as an international student, you're not allowed to do that. So when I was an international student studying my bachelor's degree, I wasn't allowed to work. But then this lawyer and the school decided like this was appropriate, and they were like, okay, you can volunteer, but you can never get anything. You're like, okay, if you volunteer at a church and then they give you food, you can't accept that food. And they took it to so much lengths to say like, oh yeah, you can work, but then you can't receive anything. If they give you even like a bottle of kimchi, you're not allowed to take it. That's the exact example they used. They were pointing towards Koreans, and they're like, okay, you volunteer at your church, you can't accept kimchi. That was an example that they used, and I was just like,
that's so...
why? And the fact is, that's actually not the legal way. It's like, okay, it's like, and the fact that, okay, my school, the international office, was actually pretty racist up until they made some changes. So they always treated us like criminals, like the fact that we're here and we're kind of like trying to be here illegally and stuff like that. And that was just their basic like understanding and their basic perspective of international students in general. And so at that point, I felt like, oh my gosh, this is... Well, I mean, it's not like they're oppressing me to like points where I'm stressed out or something, but every time I would go into that office, they would always treat me like I've done something wrong, or I don't deserve to be in America. And I never got that. I was like, what? Why are they treating me like this? I don't understand. I'm just here to study. You know why I can't study in Korea? I don't know Korean. I can't. If you can turn me into college in Korea, I would not pass any of the courses because I do not know Korean. I can't read or write Korean. I can't. And so it was racism that I felt was definitely real in America. I mean, much less so. As an Asian, there is a form of racism. It's definitely not as, let's say, prominent, because there's a much more African American presence in America and a much greater history of prejudice and discrimination and oppression. But my experience with racism, is a small experience with racism, has been this understanding that, okay, they don't want me here. I felt like an illegal immigrant, and they were trying to chase me out with whatever reason that they could find on me. And that's always how I felt when I was in college before I got my permanent residency here. It was always that feeling that the American government was out to get me just because, I'm not officially an American citizen. That's always how I felt. And it was yeah, that kind of dealing with that was a little bit hard. It's always the fact that you would, yeah, that people would judge you and just generalize you based on your race. And so I'm sure that there's greater. I mean, we can read online on news articles on whatever about
Yeah.
the great deals of racial oppression that you have. The fact that in certain cities and certain states, if a black man was pulled over by the police and he didn't have his license and registration, that would be a much stringent procedure done, rather than if a white person got caught by the police and they didn't have their license and registration, or if a Latina, if a Mexican didn't have their license or registration. It's like we can read about these things. I've read about these things, and the fact that yes, racism is prevalent. People do look and see people's physical features, their race, and they judge them as innately superior or inferior because of their nationality, because of their culture in society, because of their religion. So this was a question that I wanted to ask just to see our own personal ideas and understandings and experiences in it. Julianne, why don't you share one of your questions?
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess it kind of relates to the topic already. Do you think racist jokes are okay? I think you sort of already answered it a little bit, but if you want, feel free to, I guess, go a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, so racist jokes. So I think I've talked about jokes in general to some people and the youth. Jokes in general are only kind of, I mean, usually jokes, they can be very jovial jokes, like why did the chicken cross the road? And there can be more insulting comedy, like, you know, a Catholic, a Jew, and something walked into a bar or somewhat or other. But yeah, the fact is, when you joke, especially in a racial sense, you are participating in that form of grouping people and generalizing them based on their race. But not only that, but also a small part of you is, as this racial joke is going on, you are feeling a sense of superiority while you are inferioritizing this other race. For sure, this is what is happening, whether you want to or not, because of the racial aspect of this joke. And not only that, the fact that it's jokes in general that come at the expense of another person is always the fact that, oh, I'm more superior than this person in this aspect, that this person is inferior. You're always pushing somebody down when you're making a joke in somebody else's expense. So that's why I feel like racial jokes, I mean, so basically, Elizabeth talked about, oh, I can talk about racist Asian jokes with other Asians. I mean, at that point, it's much more, I'm not sure what kind of racist Asian jokes there are, but if an Asian wants to diss their Asian heritage, it's just basically them just communicating to one another. What would you call that? But in any case, regardless of whether you're an Asian telling an Asian joke or an African American telling an African American joke, I mean, you can say, oh yeah, we can because we're Asian, or we can because we're black or something. But jokes still are at the expense of something. And we have to keep that in mind as I don't usually make a lot of jokes, but as we make jokes, I guess. What do you think, Julianne?
Yeah, also, I guess I guess we kind of didn't maybe touch on it as much, but it's like, I mean, I guess you could I guess you'd say it's racism. Um, it's not necessarily a joke. It's just like the, I guess, predetermined idea from other people that like Asians will are just like supposed to like, I guess, congregate with other Asians, like only, like stuff like that. Like I've seen that a lot, and like I guess maybe this is more of a joke where like if like especially because like my school maybe there's like not as many Asians. Like when like for example when I was formerly in band, we went one time to like a competition, and there was like this one, like I'm like the only Asian person there, and then there was like this one other Asian person from another group, and they were like, look, it's your cousin. Like I guess that would be like kind of racist because they're just kind of looking at our the way we look and being like, oh look, another one.
Yeah. And the fact that though these kind of things seem like unharmful racism, it's not as much harmful to people as much as you're showing that there is a innate foundation of racism just in you as well as in just society around you.
And I think it's kind of like they're pointing out, oh look, you two are the same, but like you're the only two that are the same. Like we're all different from
like
you.
you're the minority
from us.
Haha.
And like and like I mean, I have eyes. I can see that that's another Asian person, and that everyone else around me is like white or whatever, and they're not Asian. But like I guess it's just like I don't need them to tell me that I'm different. I already know I'm different.
Yeah, so, it's just
yeah.
I mean, it's the fact that majority cares about majority doesn't usually care as much as minorities do because they are the majority, and it's hard definitely for white people to understand, or just the majority to understand the thought process and the experiences of a minority. And even minorities don't understand each other's perspectives either, and that's why we have to kind of be knowledgeable of these different things.
And, I was
I was also very unknowledgeable about the African American plight and their very historical kind of like deep oppression that they face not only throughout history but in America as well. I was very uninformed of that, and as such it was just never something I actually thought about. I actually never even knew. So it's something that we do have to become knowledgeable about, because, and especially for people within the majority, well, with white Americans here in America, they will not understand unless they take effort into understanding what the minority the minority experience is. Now, going into one of my questions, this one question that I had is, so we talked about personally experiencing racism, so let's talk about it in the opposite way. Have we ever been racist? And how I place this question is like this. I don't want you to talk about the time when you were racist, just because if you were racist, just try to, atone for your sins. But this question that I have is, do you have pride in any of these three categories? The national patriotism, societal, cultural, and ideological, religious. And if so, where and how?
Personally, I think everyone's at least a little tiny bit racist sometimes. Like, even, like, and like we've said, it doesn't necessarily have to be actions. It can just be thoughts. And sometimes
because it's a belief system. So if you...
Yeah.
Continue on, sorry.
And sometimes it's not necessarily your fault. Sometimes it's just the society just like pushes these, like, I guess, strong beliefs onto you, and you kind of just pick it up because you're living in that society.
Yeah.
And I think a little bit like sometimes American society, maybe other, countries, like societal, I guess, beliefs of like some like maybe slight racism can just kind of unknowingly, we just kind of pick up some of those things. And I think it's just like we need to just be as aware as possible so that we can avoid, being racist.
Yeah. So this question, when I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, nationalism, patriotism. I might have had some sort of nationalism maybe a long time ago when I was a little bit young and I was still just in Korea, or maybe when I was in America or something. But no, that kind of got destroyed like throughout my life as I realized I didn't belong here or there to this or that. Both countries like rejecting me. not physically, but still. So it was just like, oh yeah, I am an individual. I do not, my identity does not lie in any specific nation. It doesn't have any claim towards who I am. Maybe a slight claim, but not anything significant.
Yeah.
Continue on. If you have any comments.
Yeah, I think as for like the three aspects you were asking about, I think I also like generally like maybe not so much nationalism, I feel, but I definitely feel a lot of like on the societal and like cultural aspect of it, and I guess more the religious aspect. I like feel more strongly towards those than I would towards nationalistic, patriotic. Yeah.
So like you said, for me as well, societal and cultural were a little bit more bigger for me as well. My national affiliation, it was much less so, but societally, culturally, it was until it got destroyed as well in my life because of how much I've lived in all these different places, how much I've moved around constantly throughout my life. The fact is, my culture has been very kind of shaped by all these different things. I don't pertain to one certain culture because I was never in that culture for long enough. It's a mixing and mashing of various influences and different cultures and different societies within my life that have created this culture that now doesn't fit anywhere. So not only does it maybe look like a little bit like all these different cultures, but it also is not all these different cultures. And so that I've kind of come to accept that my societal kind of standards and my cultural kind of heritage, I guess, it's very individual. My culture and my society or my societal kind of expectation and standard is very individual. It is mine. And though it can fit into different cultures, it is not fully all these different cultures. And so I feel even with the societal and cultural, I don't have much pride in any singular culture and society that I could point out. The third being ideological and religious. This is much more where I focus my pride on up until it was broken. The fact that I would pride myself in being a Christian. Oh, hey, I am a Christian. I'm gonna live like a good Christian. And this is where I put my pride in up until the fact that I realized, oh, hey, I'm not a good Christian. And oh, hey, you look at the world and the news and the Christians who claim they're Christians all around you doing unchristian things, living their life far from the expectation of what Christ wanted Christians to live out. And then when you look at all that, you realize, hey, you don't need to have pride in being a Christian. You shouldn't have pride in being a Christian. You should have pride in Christ. And that's it.
Yeah.
You can't. When I say pride in being a Christian, realize that what I mean by pride is innate human desire for superiority. It's like, because I'm a Christian, I'm superior. You see, that's not something that you should have. You see, you shouldn't pride yourself in your Christianity. You shouldn't pride yourself in being a Christian. You should pride yourself in Christ, not anything of what you are. You see, because that's what the Bible teaches as well. It always teaches, hey, don't have pride. Be humble, be humble, be humble, be humble. And when it says, hey, boast, it says, hey, boast in Christ, boast in the cross. And when it talks about different nations, when it talks in the epistles of Paul, what it says is, there is no distinction between Jew or Gentile, male, female. What is it?
They're all one under Jesus.
Yeah. What is it? Oh, slave or free. There is no distinction. All
Isn't
are
that
under
in
Christ.
Galatians?
There is one in Galatians, one in Colossians, if I'm not mistaken. But the fact is, Christianity is much different than this religious Christianity that exists today. A true Christianity. Because crusades were done in the name of Christianity. That was not Christianity. There are many things being done in the name of Christianity. Pastors blowing coronaviruses away with their breath, you know? There's many things being done in the name of Christianity that aren't Christianity. And the fact is, we, as Christians, don't need to have pride in our title as Christians, or anything we do or think we are as Christians. We only need to have pride in Christ, boast in Christ, boast in the cross. And you see, all these three things, I think, slowly kind of was broken down in my life throughout my short lifespan so far, because all these things aren't Christian. You know, Christianity doesn't say, oh, hey, you know, be prideful of your nation. No, it says, hey, you are wanderers on the earth. You will have nowhere you would call home here. The home you have will be after you die in heaven with me. See, we have no home except in Christ. See, we don't need to have pride in our national heritage, our national affiliation. See, and society and culture, we don't need to, as well as nation and patriotism, we don't need to have pride in our society, our culture, our K-popness, or our what have you. You see? Our American freedom, the bald eagle, you know? Our pride, our boasting should be reserved for Christ alone as Christians. And see, this is what Christians forget. That's why we have such nationalistic Christians who put America over Christianity, America over Christ. You see? And it's a problem we have today. Because these people call themselves Christian, but how they live their life, what they believe, how they act, it's all opposed to what the Bible says, what Christ says that we ought to live and to follow after. Julianne?
Yes.
Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. I think what you said is very true, because a lot of people, they take the goodness and like the nice, way that Christianity is, and they take it to something that's maybe not so nice, like the Crusades, where you're like killing a bunch of people, and they use it to justify it and thinking that, oh, this good thing, by using it to justify it, it's gonna work because it's gonna like negate all the bad stuff. If we say it's for something good, people are gonna like look past the bad stuff and instead look more at the good stuff.
So yeah, so basically, I think that was my question, right? The three categories of pride. I feel like I've had pride in each of these categories, and as I've continued to understand Christ and try to live out my life as a Christian, God continually broke down my pride in all of those three categories. And I think, it's a lot of understanding actually who you are and what your purpose is and how you are supposed to live, that you kind of get into this understanding of what these prides are and whether they really are important or not. Julianne, did you have a question that you wanted to share?
Yes. This one also. Okay. So, this kind of focuses maybe less on, no, it's still like, I guess it focuses more on a different aspect that maybe we haven't looked at as much. God says we need to love everyone, including. So how can we love every race? Because obviously we've established that racism is wrong. So obviously we shouldn't be like looking at other people as inferior. But then if you look on the other side of that, who are looking at other people as inferior, how do we love them?
And you can't. That's the best answer I have. You can't love somebody. Jesus says, hey, love others as you love yourself. And the fact is, you can't love others as you love yourself when you think you're better than everybody else.
Yeah.
You see? You can't be a racist Christian. It just doesn't exist. It shouldn't exist. Christians were very complicit in racism, not only in America, but in many places around the world. But the fact is, they shouldn't be. It's not whether they were or they weren't, it's they shouldn't be. That's the most important thing. So if Christians are complicit to racism, either when they figure that out, they decide, oh, hey, I would rather be a racist than a Christian, or hey, I would rather be a Christian than a racist. It's a decision that they will have to make, that they do have to make. Because one cannot exist alongside the other. But the fact is, in America, it has for so long. Christians who are nonchalant about racism in America, who don't care and don't love others enough to care about the oppression of minorities in America, they are not being Christian. As much as they claim to be, they are not being the full and true extent of what Christianity is. And they should be. And so, to be racist and to be Christian is an oxymoron in itself. And it's an oxymoron that many people decide to actually live out. So, it's a problem, for sure. Not only in America, but in major parts of the world. And we need to deal with it. And the first way is to really acknowledge it and be informed of it.
I think you answered a question. How can we love everyone if we are racist? I meant to ask the question, how can we love everyone, including racists? Like, how can we love racists?
Okay. Just because people are racist doesn't mean you get to not love them.
Yeah.
You can't decide, oh, hey, I'm going to love these people and not love these people. That's also not what Jesus teaches. He teaches love all people, regardless of what they've done, regardless of who they
sinners.
are. Yeah. So,
they're just showing their sin in a different way.
Yeah, and it's hard to, most definitely. Who wants to love racists? Who wants to love pedophiles? Who wants to love rapists? Who wants to love murderers and criminals? But it's not our decision, our judgment to say, oh, these people don't deserve love. And other people, they do deserve love. Christ's love is not a matter of you deserve it or you do not. It's a matter of, oh, I love you despite what you've done and who you are.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of love that we have to be showing as Christians.
Yeah, essentially, we can't just, focus on the fact that they're a racist. We need to look at them first as a person, not first as a racist. When we talk to them or approach them or interact with them in any way, we can't just be oh, they're a racist, if it's written on their forehead, that's their defining trait.
Yeah. And see, that's also
as a person.
That's also another aspect of superiority and inferiority. It's almost this religious pride The fact that, oh, hey, I'm a Christian, I'm not a racist. Oh, you are a racist. Oh, you're inferior than me. Oh, you don't deserve the love of Christ, or something like that. You see, this is how the aspect of pride and how it affects and comes into every
Mhm.
aspect of our lives is actually so crazy, because it actually invades every aspect of our life. And the fact is, we need to acknowledge it. We need to be knowledgeable of how this works. But yeah, like you said, Julianne, the fact that, yeah, we can't pick and choose who we love. We're called to love, and we love all people regardless.
Mhm.
So, I have a question. This is a question that was kind of, yeah, it goes around in the circles that I live in. Probably not you guys so much, but the question is, okay, so are monochromatic churches bad, or are monocultural churches bad? And if so, are multicultural churches the answer? Do you understand my question?
Yes. Um, I think in some ways it can be a little bit, I guess, bad, but I think in a lot of ways it's good too. Like, um, a lot of times some, people maybe just because of the way society is, they feel maybe more comfortable around people that are similar to themselves. So monocultural churches would be more attractive to them. And I know generally you're not supposed to be like, oh, I want to go to this church, not this church. Like, you should like be able to like worship God no matter what. But for people perhaps who are maybe like new to Christianity, I think if they're more comfortable around like their own culture and stuff, it's probably it would be easier for them maybe to become like acclimated into a church if it were monocultural. Now, the ways that it could be bad, I guess, is that sometimes the culture uh, takes more, I guess, importance than the actual religious aspects. And so people like tend to take cultural things more seriously than they should. Kind of how like um, I don't remember one time. I think I talked to you about how um, there are certain, or I don't know, some sort of Bible study where we were talking about how there are certain, I guess, activities in a church that aren't as necessary and important, like things that aren't actually like religiously important activities that we tend to put lots of importance into, and it's not necessary. So that's one way I think it can also. In another thing about monocultural churches that could be bad is it, I guess, shuns people who aren't of the culture away from that church, obviously. So those are just some, I guess, general things.
And what do you think about multicultural churches then? Are they the
Oh
answer?
yeah. Um, what do you mean by they're the answer?
So, first, do you think the monochromatic churches are bad or have a problem? And if that, does multicultural churches solve this problem, or are the answer to the badness or the problems that we have in monochromatic churches?
I think that they do have some of the answer. Because uh, not being monocultural, it's open to like everybody and anybody. So it's not like, oh, we kind of like only want Korean people here. Instead, it's like, oh, no matter who you are, you can come here. And then also, it's good because I guess since there's not just focusing on one culture, they don't really put as much importance into like specific cultural aspects of the church. Instead, they focus on the religious aspects, which is very important. Ways that it doesn't have the answer is being diverse can also be a negative but only if it's handled like in the wrong way. If you make everyone feel like they belong, even though everyone's different, then yes, it has the answer. But if people still feel like they don't belong, then it's not the answer. Because I have been to like some multicultural churches, and some of them, I felt like, oh yeah, this is cool. We're all like together, even though we're different. Like, this is great and stuff. And then sometimes there have been churches where it was like, I kind of feel like I'm separate, like I'm different, and not just because like I'm new, like, or maybe just some more like cultural reasons, like there's not as many people as me, people aren't coming up to me as much, but they're coming up to other people. So that's one way it might not have the answer. But I think as long there's ways that a church can still be inclusive to everybody. So yeah. And I think there's also ways for monocultural churches to be better as well. Like, yes, maybe they have their culture, but if they maybe put less focus, like, yes, okay, we're all Korean, but if we don't we can't put so much importance into that to where we kind of lose sight a little bit of the religious aspects.
Yeah. So, see, this is the kind of questions that run around my circle, because I talk to a lot of pastors, and I just discuss these kind of things more than you guys would, for sure. So with that, we kind of discuss these kind of things about monocultural churches, because most of the people that I know are pastors of Korean churches, but they're also not like completely Asian, just like me. So it's different for them as well. And the aspect of kind of monocultural, monochromatic churches comes up more, because our church is also very monochromatic, monocultural. It's a majority Korean church, along with a small EM ministry, English ministry. So the fact is, when I talk about are monochromatic churches bad, it's not an answer of whether it is bad or it isn't bad. It's a matter of what is wrong with monochromatic.
Yeah, what is specifically?
Churches. Yeah,
I think what I said earlier about like cultural things taking more importance over religious things. I think that's like if not the most important problem.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think we did discuss this because because that's the same thing that I think as well. The fact that it's for Korean churches, just not even Korean churches, if it's a monocultural, monochromatic church, the fact is Koreans mix in culture into Christianity to the point that they don't understand which is which. Is this actually a cultural thing, or is this a Christian thing? And they don't understand which is which. And when you have a monochromatic, monocultural church, it's much harder to distinguish what is culture and what is Christianity. And the fact is, we cannot let culture become Christianity, because the fact is, it's not. Christianity is Christianity, and when culture goes against Christianity, it's the duty and responsibility of that culture to weed out the cultural aspects that go against Christianity. And you see, it's just like when the Jewish Christians were trying to force the Gentile Christians to get circumcised, because they're like, to be a Christian, to be a follower of Christ, you have to be circumcised. But then what the Apostle Paul argues is the fact that no, they don't have to be circumcised. Stop trying to force your culture into their culture.
Yeah, and a circumcised person can not be a Christian
Yeah.
too. Like,
And also the fact about eating unclean animals and stuff like that. There was a lot of things like Jewish cultural that Paul went against and said, no, they don't have to follow this. This is a cultural thing for you guys. But we have to weed out what's actually cultural and what's actually Christian. And so this is actually a big problem in monocultural churches. And because I serve in a Korean church, this is a big problem in Korean churches as well. The fact that we can't discern as effectively what is culture and what is Christianity. And the fact that even more, because we're a Korean church, we'd rather keep this culture and try to make it Christian rather than to keep a pure Christianity and to let go of these cultural aspects that aren't Christian. You see? So this is a big issue, not for many, many monochromatic churches. Because of that fact is why we have different it looks like different Christianities. Like when you come to a Korean church and when you go to an American church and when you go to some other cultural church, it looks like different Christianities because we have so integrated culture into Christianity that culture has become Christianity. And see, that's a cycle back to history when culture and Christianity comes together and the Crusades happen, or when culture and Christianity come together and we start massacring people while colonizing different places, saying, oh, this is Christianity. Take away all your culture, come into our culture, because culture is Christianity. You see, it's a revert back, a step back, then a step forward. And that's what we have to understand and realize. The fact that culture, realize that's a second aspect. Culture and Christianity are different. And we must have it remain different. Yes. And as Christians, we need to focus on Christianity rather than culture. Now, I'm not going to go into all the depth of what's wrong with many Korean churches and Korean culture, just because. but there are things that are cultural, and we do need to claim that they're cultural rather than, oh, this is how you become more religious or how you show you're more holy or something or other, claiming that it's Christian when it's actually just cultural. And so, with the monochromatic churches, then, are multicultural churches the answer? Well, they do solve a bit of the problem in the fact that since there's much more cultures, you see much more cultures, and you realize, oh, hey, that aspect was maybe just a cultural thing. And maybe it shouldn't be included in our Christianity, you see? And so that does... So if a problem of a monocultural church is that, yes, a multicultural church will solve that. But why I think monocultural churches are actually necessary is because of language barriers. Cultural similarities, I don't want to go into that because I don't want to put culture into Christianity. But language barrier is a big issue because of the fact that some Koreans can only speak Korean and only speak Korean fluently, and they can't understand English as well. So when we're talking and when pastors are preaching about things in English, they're not going to be able to understand that. So the aspect of language is actually very crucial in a monocultural church because why Koreans or many Koreans come to Korean church is because they can't understand English as well, but they can understand Korean. And just like how Americans don't come to a Korean church and listen to the Korean sermon because they don't understand the Korean sermon, they understand English better, you see? And so it's a very different... So the fact that it's not that monocultural churches have a problem and should be dissolved, it's just that there's a necessity for monocultural churches because of language barriers. But the fact is monocultural churches also have to fix this problem of placing culture into Christianity. Yes. So with that, I've thought a lot about this issue, is why I have a lot to say about this issue. But I think we've discussed it, and what you've understood from that, Julianne, is actually right. The fact that culture should not come into Christianity. Or should not be Christianity should not be compromised for the inclusion of culture. But I would rather culture be put aside and Christianity to shine forth as the main product. But with that, a multicultural church is what we should strive after. And that's why we have Korean churches with English ministries. We have big American churches with Hispanic ministries, with Spanish ministries, with all these different ethnic ministries as well, because they want to be a multicultural church, yet also understand the language barrier. You see?
Yeah, they want to like accept as many people as possible, which is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and see, that's the kind of thing that churches have to deal with, and as Christians we have to deal with. And the most crucial thing, and that we've talked about so far, that we need to understand is that culture and Christianity are different. So we have to be able to discern the two as two different things instead of one. So we're running a little bit out of time. Let's do a few more questions. Julianne,
all right.
If you can give us one last question that you have.
All right. So this is a question maybe a little bit less about Christianity, more about just racism in general. What are your thoughts on reverse racism, which is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism on the basis of race directed against a member of a dominant or privileged race?
Yeah. And for that, we don't have to put qualifiers onto racism. Racism is racism. Black people can be racist towards white people. I mean, just like white people can be racist towards black people. Racism is a belief held by people, and people can be racist no matter if they're in the minority or the majority. Usually, minorities are racist towards the majority, and majority are racist towards the minority. That's what happens. That's just what happens. But the fact is, it's not the fact that this kind of racism exists or that kind of racism exists. We shouldn't define even further what racism is, but we should just say, hey, this is racism, and we need to deal with racism. Not the fact that, oh, there's this kind of racism and that kind of racism, and there can be racism of white people racist to black people, and black people racist to white people, and Asians be racist to Hispanic people. We don't have to define all these different racisms. We just have to understand that, hey, racism is racism, and we have to deal with racism. That's all we have to do. And
I think for me, I definitely think, like, yes, it is possible to be racist to a white person, but I don't really think it's like a huge problem compared to like racism towards minority.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, when there's one guy, you know, and he's, you know, kind of bullying this group of people, it's a lot less. I mean, I'm not saying that it's right. It is wrong. Bullying is wrong. And one guy bullying a group, it's much less threatening than a group of people threatening one person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, it's not as big of an issue, but racism is racism.
And I think with like the definitions that I've learned, or that we've like kind of discussed, it definitely broadens the topic, because honestly, before I like kind of searched more, I had a pretty shallow, like, I guess, definition of racism in my mind. I kind of just thought of it as like racism is just against
prejudice or discrimination.
But then it's more of like just, it also includes like nationality and like culture and ethnicity. And so like essentially like a white person can be racist to another white person.
Yeah. As like well as Asians can be racist towards Asians.
Yeah. Because I know like in history, whenever like Americans, you know, were there, and then some like the Irish immigrants came over, there was something called nativism, where basically the people who had been living in America were like, oh, we're better than these immigrants who are coming here to America. And that's, I think, would count technically as racism. And they kind of look down on them. Also, like, it brings in like the different aspects like of religion, because the Irish that came over were Catholics and the people in America were not Catholic, so they were like kind of going against each other in that way.
Yeah, and so with that, I'll give one last question, or not really
Okay.
a question, but it's actually just a kind of just what we've learned so far throughout this podcast, and what you've learned, Julianne, throughout this podcast, and you having to research these different things and try to gain a better understanding of what race and racism is how should we as Christians, how should my Christianity define my perspective of racism? Where is the intersection between Christianity and racism? And we've kind of talked about this, but yeah.
I think with obviously with Christianity, racism cannot go along with it. Like, you can't be a racist and be like a true Christian, because God calls us to love everyone, and that includes people of different races. No matter how they are different from us, we need to love them still. And so I definitely, like, already, I guess before this, I thought racism was wrong, but I guess from what I've learned, it's kind of something, I guess, racism has roots that have spread like a lot, like all over, even into Christianity. And we need to just become more aware of like where racism is like popping up and like where it's coming from, and just kind of understanding it more so that we can like not be racist.
Yeah. And see, when I was trying to understand racism and understand Christianity in terms of racism, see, the intersection point for me and where the two collided in racism is in this understanding of pride and of love. When you are being racist, your pride shoots through the roof and you have a lack of love. But where that racism intersects with Christianity is we ought to be loving towards each other and to not be prideful but be humble. And see, this as Christians is how we live out our Christianity on the subject of racism. We expound on our love and we humble ourselves, knowing, understanding that all people are created equal without distinction in the eyes of God. Everybody is equally valuable, no matter what race they're from, no matter what they look like. You see? And it comes down not even to racism, but when we come back to the foundation, it's the fact that everybody is equal, whether they are handicapped, whether they are, whether they have a genetic disorder, whether they have less money than you do, whether they're a homeless person, whether they work at McDonald's, what have you. Every person is created equal, whether they're the president or they're a blue-collar worker. Every person should be treated as equal. And the fact is, in society, they're not. Especially in this capitalistic American society, it is not. People with more money are treated better than people that don't have more money. People that have more status and power, people who are middle class have more power than people who are lower class. People who are higher in the upper class category have more power than people in the middle class. There is an inequality in America that stems from pride and a lack of love. Not only to make racism, but to create these wealth inequalities, all these social disparities. Everything that is wrong with America has a root an aspect of it found in people with an innate desire to be superior than another. People with an innate desire to love themselves more than they love others. And see, this is where it intersects for me. This is where I was like, yes, this is the problem that we as Christians need to deal with. The problem of racism, problem of all of these things are surface problems for this foundational understanding that we as Christians, we as people, rather be more proud of ourselves, rather love ourselves more than to think of the people around us. And this is what we need to think about as Christians. So with that, this was our podcast for today concerning race and racism, racial relations and disparities within our world, within our reality. For everybody who has joined into our podcast, thank you guys all for joining in and listening to our really, really long discussion. I was planning for it to be around this time, but I didn't know that we would actually use up all of this time. I was like, oh yeah, we have this time planned out, but I'm sure we're gonna go short. But
yeah, thank you to everybody who watched
and commented.
Commented.
Next time, if you guys have any
cool that people actually watched. I was afraid nobody.
Yeah, I thought there was gonna be like one, two people, and I was like, oh,
that's gonna be so.
At least, it was 4 times more than I expected. So.
Yeah.
So thank you guys all, and if you guys, we're gonna have another podcast next week. Our guest speaker is still to be decided. Our co-host is still to be decided. But we will continue to try to build up this podcast so that not only can you guys have an educational time and a enjoyable time here listening to us speak, but that you guys can also participate with us, not only as being a guest speaker in our podcast or just writing down questions so that we can discuss it within our podcast. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll be back with you guys next Wednesday at 2. Okay, so Julianne, I want to thank you for being my guest and co-host for this first session of our Youth2Talk, and for everybody watching, we'll see you guys next week. Bye.